Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for our fourth installment of our webinar series, NYSCA Presents. Welcome, I'm Mara Manis, Executive Director of NYSCA. As we shift from short-term response to this pandemic and longer-term planning and execution, we are pleased to present, in partnership with the Charities Bureau, important financial and governance guidance for arts organizations. We are thrilled today to welcome Bureau Chief Jim Sheehan to discuss these particularly timely topics that organizations of all sizes are now facing. With the official reopening of New York State regions, we are grateful to Governor Cuomo's steadfast leadership, as well as his recognition of the critical role that arts play in the health and vitality of our state. The NYSCA team is dedicated to supporting you in every way we can as a resource during this time. In this unprecedented moment of immense challenge and uncertainty, NYSCA remains committed to bolstering equity, meaningful education, and creativity. Artists have historically created out of adversity and collective pain, and artists will contribute to our healing as we move forward together to strengthen our communities, our state, and our country. As we all know, Black Lives Matter. Today's presentation will be posted on our website this afternoon, along with relevant materials, and you will also be able to find on our website our previous webinars on fundraising myths, digital communications, and a legal guide for moving your content online. And we're so delighted to share that these webinars have been viewed by almost 3,000 members of our community to date. Throughout today's presentation, we are welcoming questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to respond to as many as possible during the broadcast. However, the Charities Bureau and Jim specifically has assured me that they will try their best to respond to the remainder that we weren't able to cover today. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Jim Sheehan, the Bureau Chief of New York Attorney General's Charities Bureau, which oversees compliance and regulation of the nation's largest charity sector. Also joining us is Deputy Chief Karen Kunstler-Goldman. Prior to this role, Jim was the first Chief Integrity Officer of New York City's Human Resources Administration, overseeing audit, investigation, and data analysis for the nation's largest social service agency. Jim also served as New York State's first Medicaid Inspector General. It's an honor to welcome you, Jim, today, and over to you. You're muted.
Mute. Okay, we're good. Thank you very much, Mara. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate NYSCA assisting us in reaching out to the arts community of New York State. We're going to go through some legal, factual, and policy issues today in this PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is available for distribution. It's my understanding from NYSCA and also from us if you want to use it. And as I say, we very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to the arts community today. Next slide, please. The Charities Bureau is overseen by Attorney General Tish James, who no one needs to be reminded what a difference she's made in the state of New York, and her commitment to charities generally and arts organizations in particular is tremendous, and we really appreciate her support and her work in this area. Next slide, please. Whenever you give a presentation like this, we try to give you some preliminaries. The first one is the disclaimer. That is, I can be wrong and I can change my mind with new information. The COVID presents novel policy and legal issues, and the extent you have particular circumstances in your organization, you should consider obtaining your own professional advice. The second issue is that we're going to be talking about New York statutes and regulations and guidance documents in this presentation. They are all available on our website, which is charitiesnys.com. The third thing is that we do these presentations so that people can use them, and so that they're helpful to listeners and to people they communicate with. So if you find things in this presentation that are useful, you can obtain a copy of the PowerPoint, either as a PowerPoint or as a PDF from us or from NYSCA, and please contact me if you'd like an electronic copy. Next slide, please. So this audience, I don't need to tell that New York is the world center for the arts. And sometimes we think of that as the major players, and those are the legacy institutions: Metropolitan Museum, MoMA, Natural History, Guggenheim, the Sea, Air and Space Museum, the Albright Knox Gallery, and George Eastman. These are the biggest players in New York State. Most of them were founded by specific acts of the legislature from the 19th century, except for Intrepid. But it's important to think beyond. They're a very valuable part of our heritage and our state, but it's very important to understand that arts in New York State go far beyond the traditional legacy institutions that attract millions of visitors from overseas and other states. And that is the grassroots. And I know NYSCA has done a great job of building and supporting organizations for as long as I've been here. And thinking about grassroots, it's important to think about how volunteers fit into that picture, how getting people to participate in the arts, both as audiences, but also as active and learning is important. The donations that come from the public and the support that is gathered for organizations through NYSCA and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And these, if you look at us compared to other states, there's so much more involvement and investment by not just by the arts sector and by the citizens, but also by the elected officials to make sure that this continues. The third set of players are private grantors and foundations. And again, we are blessed in New York to have, you may hear a lot about the Silicon Valley and Washington State, but I believe 8 of the 10 largest foundations in the country are based in New York. And that makes a big difference in terms of funds available for this activity and creative direction. The next piece to me that is significant is how much a role New York plays internationally in education, experience, and development for arts professionals. I speak at a variety of colleges and universities around the state and graduate programs in arts management and art development. And it is impressive to me when I go in those classes, probably a third of the people in the classes are from outside the country, and over half are from outside the state of New York. And they come here not just for the education, but also for the exposure to New York institutions, for traineeships, often for their first jobs. And they go back and educate people on what arts are available in New York and why we're different from the rest of the world. And the final piece that is important we'll be talking about today as a World Center is arts education and outreach. And in preparing for this presentation, I was extremely impressed with how much a part of the mission of the Charities of New York includes education and outreach, not just for primary and secondary schools and universities, but also for adults and communities. And it makes a huge difference in the life that we have here and the life that we live. Next slide, please. So having said that, it's important to recognize the scope of the issue that we're about to face and are facing with respect to cultural institutions and arts organizations. And I focused on this slide because very often arts organizations that are not buildings, that have no building, fade away, and it's hard to keep track of what they're doing and how effective they are and whether they're continuing. But museums typically have a building, so we can measure relatively easily when they stop. And in the hard times of 2008 to 2010, 50 museums closed in the United States out of 35,000. But UNESCO and the International Council of Museums now estimate that 1 in 8 museums worldwide would face permanent closure from COVID-19, which is a huge number. And that's based in part on the scope of the pandemic, but it's also based upon the audience changes over the last 50 years, which Nina Simon describes in her book. One of the areas that has the most significant risk are history museums. And if you look around the state of New York, some large percentage of the museums in New York are historical museums, and many of them are historic houses that face additional challenges, which we'll talk about. But that's a huge risk. And again, looking to the New York Times, which has done very good coverage on these issues generally, the story about the Tenement Museum and others museums that are facing significant risk and significant difficulties, that was that April 21st article, and the April 29th article about if you're not going to survive the virus, how do you close one down? We're not very good in the United States about end-of-life planning, whether it's individuals or as organizations. And so the best guidance document I found in this area, and I'm not suggesting that you want to shut down, but you want to think about the issues that you may confront and how you're going to address them if you have to, is Museum Space Enclosure from the British Museum Association. The very good document, and my understanding is that, Mara, that will be distributed after this presentation.
That will be, and it will be available on our website. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So, hard times in 2020. One of the challenges for board members and for officers of arts organizations, you always got 3 balls in the air anyway. And, but now you have a problem you didn't sign up for, a problem that threatens the very existence of the organization. And sometimes we have heard in the past, when there are crises, that board members or officers say, I didn't sign up for this. But the reality is in life, you can't plan for everything, and you've got to deal with the crises that you confront. And the strength of leadership is in responding to crises you didn't plan for. And in this situation, leadership and staff have to cope with, even if you reopen and operate, how do you deal with social distancing issues? How do you deal with the cost of COVID-19 compliance? How do you address the fact that performing arts and museums, which are a large part of the arts community in New York, you sell no tickets, you get no admissions, you have to cancel your fundraising events, and sometimes have to lose your deposit. And candidly, state and local government funding deficits are going to be huge unless there's a package from Washington to save it. And we're going to see cuts in everything, unfortunately, that may well include arts activities. And there'll be other priorities in terms of spending for the state government too. And the final issue I think that is significant is what I'll call habit and memory. We all have, I'll call it habits. So we live in Albany, and in the winter we go to a number of the museums that are along I-90 between Williamstown and Syracuse, because it's a good time of year to do it. And there are new exhibits and other things all the time. If you don't get to go for a significant period of time, people's habits change, and people's interests are affected by what they've done recently. So making sure that your audience knows, your participants know that you're still there and engaged is really important. Next slide, please.
I think, Jim, I will just add to that, which is we've seen so many of our grantees successfully transition their work to online and really garner even new audiences that they never expected. So that's been a real plus. And it's one that we're featuring on our website, but we're hearing more and more about, and it's even being reviewed in the Times, which is fantastic.
Well, and I think we talk about hard times. I didn't sign up for this in crises, but the other thing is it's an opportunity, as we'll see later, to rethink who you reach, how you reach them, what your responsibility is, and does it work? And the other thing in this context is you may want to think, do you need directors who have skills and talents that are different from the directors you have now, and should be added to the organization's board or other guidance responsibilities? Next slide, please. So the question for today that we think is really important is, what happens to officers and directors when survival and mission issues are identified? When I say mission issues, if you can't do what you're doing now, what else can you do that satisfies your mission? And this kind of situation is a huge challenge, and there are no awards that I know of for successfully navigating a crisis. We give awards for successful achievements in other areas, but not so much for this. So I wanted to praise some of the people who have stepped up in crisis situations in the nonprofit sector. And the first one would be the College of New Rochelle, which was unfortunately a liberal arts college in New Rochelle, which had been there for over 100 years. And they discovered that their CFO had failed to report certain obligations and failed to pay the withholding taxes for the organization, which put them in a very difficult financial position. And the board did, and the college did very careful analysis of where they were and realized that they could not continue as a college. And that didn't happen overnight. That required consulting with the constituencies within the college and the alumni and the state and other places. And the board members stuck with this process for over 2 years. There is no more College New Rochelle. However, the students who were at the College New Rochelle were, the board and the faculty and the administration arranged for opportunities at Mercy College that paralleled what had been offered at the College New Rochelle. Very hard decisions, very difficult process. A lot of people unhappy at the idea of closing down, but they did the right and responsible thing. Berkshire Museum, which is located in Pittsfield, just over the border, made a decision to change its direction, and they decided to deaccession some of their artworks. You may have seen some of the press coverage in the New York Times, the Boston Globe. Initial reaction was very, very negative, and they stuck to their viewpoint. And they didn't, the decision to sell and how to sell and what they were prepared to sell was not taken lightly. It was part of a much larger overall strategy. A lot of criticism before the pandemic, but it probably saved the Berkshire Museum from having to close. And I think that's an impressive result. The Delaware Art Museum overcommitted itself on expansion plans, and they believe there was no alternative but to deaccession some of their artwork. Again, it's still around, but the museum director faced significant difficulties, and that's, the issue is what happens there. The Museum Directors Association said no more visiting programs, so not a good example of where you want to go. Miriam Nelson was the president of Hampshire College. She was there for a year, looked at the finances and said she didn't want to admit the first year class unless she was confident that the college would survive and continue. The board then said, thank you very much. And this often happens, that being the bearer of the news that is there is problematic. You have to think about how to deliver the message, and then you have to be aware that the public reaction or the constituency reaction is going to be so negative that you have to leave. And the final one I'll cite is Jeb Spalding, who was the Chancellor of Vermont State Colleges. And I'm convinced this was intentional, though there's nothing in the stories to tell you. He announced they had to close a campus because their funding was insufficient to cover the campuses they had open. Within 5 days, he had tendered his resignation, which was accepted by the board with a lot of praise for his work. And what is happening in Vermont now is the state legislature and the public are galvanized to substantially increase the funding for state colleges to keep these facilities open and students attending.
And that was part of his strategy, correct?
That's my inference from the sequence of events, yes.
Yeah, right. And we all know that Hampshire College is still an open and thriving institution.
That's at least this year, that's right.
This year it is, okay. Let's take it, okay.
Thanks, Mara. Next slide, please. So one of the key words in the charities world is stewardship, and has biblical overtones, but the key is, how do you spend your treasure? How do you spend your time? How do you use your talents? And what I want to leave you with here is a focus on mission, and that for the most part, that doesn't mean buildings, that doesn't mean specific programs, but overall, what is the mission of this organization? How does it contribute to the community? What commitments have been made as an organization to do that? And part of the stewardship is preserving staff. How much is it going to cost, and what is the consequence of preserving staff? I'm not going to tell you how to make those decisions, but there are tremendous tensions there, especially with long-term staff who cannot do things during the COVID-19 situation. You have to decide to what extent their talents and energies are useful and necessary, and are necessary for the organization to continue. Facilities, buildings, and other facilities, materials and collections, and what's the cost and what's the benefit? Tough questions for every institution. Reputation and goodwill and the ability to restart. If you make hard money decisions now, will you be able to begin, go back to what you're doing, or expand your activities or modify your activities? That's again, a decision which requires thought and preparation. Notice and engagement. One of the temptations that we see in organizations when hard times happen is that the administration, the officers and the directors focus inward And it's very important to be candid with your community, and that's both the internal community and the external community, and about what the situation is, what hard decisions have to be made, and to engage them in the discussion about what we do here and how we do it. Digital presence, Mara, you talked about that already, and I know that NYSCA has already done a presentation on that. One of the things about COVID-19 that is fascinating is the extent to which we've all been forced to go digital and think about what works and how we interact with each other. This is a good opportunity. And I talked earlier about thinking about adding people to your board who have an expertise, which would be useful. This is one to think about. And finally, talking about transfers and deaccessions. For example, in the art world, or in the case of New York City Opera, costumes and props, you can no longer do the activities that you have the property for. To whom should you transfer it, and what kind of commitments do you want about what they'll do with it? Next slide, please.
Jim, I have a quick question that was coming from our audience that's somewhat relevant to income. Just wondering if you have a perspective on this, if you or Karen. What is a reasonable length of time to hold advanced ticket income for postponed events from the spring of 2020 that may not be rescheduled until the spring of 2021? Okay,
so let's talk about that a little bit. Here's the first issue is what did you communicate when you sold the ticket, right? Probably nothing, because you didn't anticipate a pandemic. What kind of communication are you having with your donors and with your ticket buyers once you find you can't do the program? And what I've seen on a number of websites is that organizations are telling people, we would like you to consider it as a contribution. And the reaction has been significantly positive from what I've been seeing. That people
I've heard that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So communication, telling people that, like some airlines, we're not going to give you your money back and it's too bad, is not the way to go. Part of this is building your relationship for the long term. So I would try to find a way to say, please contribute. And you have the option of either extending the ticket to 2021 or making the contribution. And again, I've seen organizations who've been very successful in doing that. And part of it's just, we all know we're in this together, and communicating that and communicating your situation, and we're grateful for the support, and engage them as part of the future of the organization. So
great, thank you.
Okay, now I'm going to get highly technical on you because the statute is highly technical, but it's important. If your organization has an endowment or it has institutional funds, that is funds available for investment, there is very specific statutory law in New York governing how that endowment is to be managed, how it is to be spent, and how it's to be invested. And even without an endowment, if you have institutional funds, there are very specific standards for how those funds are to be invested, managed, or used. And the Times did a good story on June 2nd about what they call the sacrosanct endowment. And in the context of that story, they talked about we are planning a document on the use of endowment funds, which we're fine-tuning. We expect to have out in June. And Mara, I think we talked about having you distribute it when it comes out.
Yep, we'll be doing that. Absolutely.
And so the key here is what is what we call NYPMFA, right? The New York Prudent Management Institutional Funds Act. What does it require and expect? And our statute is to some degree defining expectations. How should you manage? How should you invest? So let me start off with something that doesn't exist. There is no such thing as borrowing from the endowment. If you are spending money from the endowment, it's not like Social Security where you just put an IOU in the box and say, I guess that's a bad metaphor for here, but you can't borrow. If you take endowment money and spend it, you have to go through the process that NYPMFA contemplates. And that means that the board must appropriate money from the endowment. And the appropriation has to be prudent. So there has to be an actual board minutes or finance committee minutes that say, we are appropriating X dollars from the endowment, and it's for this purpose, and and respecting the time period that the organization is to exist for. And those minutes should reflect investigation the board undertook, right? here's where we are. We're getting no ticket money. We're getting we can't have our fundraisers. We believe this to be short-term. We believe the most prudent thing to do is to spend endowment money as opposed to borrow or whatever your other options are. And we carefully considered the alternatives to the spending of endowment, which might include how do we cut costs, how do we expand our mission in different directions, how do we approach donors to see if they're willing to tide us through or foundations. And those minutes should be very specific. Yes, Mark.
Yeah, I just, a question in terms of drafting that rationale to be included in the minutes, is that done in cooperation or advisement with your auditor or with your legal counsel? Who else is involved in the developing of that rationale?
Okay, since it's a minute document, if you have counsel, it's useful to have them understand the myth of the statute and how boards work. If you don't have counsel, the key is it's not just words on a paper. It is reflecting the reality in the organization of, we thought about these issues, we thought about the alternatives, we consulted our community, and this is where we think we have to go. So
it's reflective of the process that they've arrived at. I mean, the rationale is reflective of the process they've gone through. Got it. Thank you.
Exactly. So the statute says you can appropriate funds from your endowment. All right. But the max, if you appropriate more than 7% of fair market value in a year, it's more complicated than that, but let's use that 7% rule. The statute says there's a rebuttable presumption of imprudence. So the idea here is, in the old days, it used to be you could only spend income, meaning interest or dividends. Then they changed it to appropriation of a portion of the asset pool. The rebuttable presumption of imprudence is the statutory standard for us to review what is being done by charities in New York State. Now, there are obviously circumstances in which it would be prudent for the organization to spend more than 7%. And that's why we go back to what appropriation, what findings were made. Borrowing is never okay. We're going to call that imprudent by definition if you're borrowing from the endowment, because it's not a thing. And so in difficult times, in my view, and that's what our guide's going to talk about, you can exceed the 7%, but you need to have this prudent and thoughtful process to make that decision. You may also decide to use your endowment or portion of your endowment as collateral for a third-party loan for short term, right? And that, again, that's managing your institutional funds. But I'd expect to see the same kind of analysis. Next thing to look at is endowment and gift instruments. So in addition to your endowment, which if you have a fundraiser where you say we're establishing an endowment for this organization for $5 million, you have committed, that's a restricted asset. But in addition to that, you're going to have assets that where you get money for a specific production, or you get money for a specific addition to your collection, or you get money for administration of a wing. And you have to respect the restrictions that are imposed by that gifts instrument, both because it's a donor relationship and also because New York is very protective of the intentions of donors. That doesn't mean you can't spend it. It does mean if they're living donors, you have to go back to them if you want to release restrictions and say, please, under our current circumstances, consider it. And again, we've seen some very good discussions by the city of New York in particular about relaxing restrictions and about some foundations and other donors relaxing those restrictions. The next thing that you need to make sure of is that your CFO or your development office has a catalog of what your restricted gifts are and what the limitations are. The statute allows for release of restrictions. So if you have money for example, for art scholarships, and it's for Dutchess County, for example, and you've had no students from Dutchess County for 5 years, and you couldn't spend the money, we will work with you. You can, if it's under $100,000 and over 20 years, we'll work with you on releasing those restrictions administratively. The Charities Bureau can do that. If it's more than that, you have to go to the courts to release the restrictions. We'll work with you on that, and we're working with some institutions now to look at release of restrictions on endowments. But again, we look to the arts organization to say, here's our plan, here's why we think it will work, here's how we've consulted our community, here's how we've looked at it from a financial perspective, and it's successful. So this this is obviously, we could do an entire PowerPoint on this issue alone. I wanted to give you an idea of what the issues are.
I also think this brings up one of the key topics from our first webinar, which is the importance of donor relationships in good times and bad. So it's important that that you really solidify those relationships and that they're really ongoing in that communication. So when we hit these kind of times, there's an understanding and there's already a foundation on which to have these conversations.
And as every development officer will tell you, is that people like to be asked, right? They like to be asked to help and they feel good about doing it.
Absolutely.
Not everybody, not all the time, but it's important to make the ask in this context, not just for money, but for helping the organization survive in difficult times.
Yep.
Next slide, please. Deaccessioning. So this is a very, very difficult issue, and it doesn't just apply to museums. It also applies to libraries, to art collections and galleries of various types. And as we saw in the New York City Opera, it can apply to props and costumes. And this is an area that I think it's fair to say that the regulators have not, the various regulators have not yet had to face major issues. Like Delaware Art Museum is an exception. Berkshire Museum is an exception. We're going to see this more and more, that consideration of, should we keep things in the vault in our own facility, or should we use it to fund ongoing operations? And there's no one good answer to this question, but I think you're going to see more and more that there's an interest in deaccessioning works that are not part of the collection of the organization, and to use those funds to keep the organization going. So, you know, the states, if you're a museum, the regions have their own rules about deaccession, which are very strict. As a charities regulator, we're a little more respectful of the decision of directors and officers, but we want to, again, have a basis how you got there. Professional associations, as we've seen this year, are changing their opinion on this issue. One of the questions, you know, that has to be asked in deaccessioning is, who are you going to sell to, and what restrictions do you put on the sale? And I think there's some good examples in Fisk University and the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. But the key is, I think, none of us want to see great art end up in these warehouse in Delaware, basically as it's like the Fort Knox of art. No one gets to see it. No one gets to look at it. No one gets to use it. It's just there as a financial asset. And that's been happening to some degree around the world, and they will happen more. And the next issue is, what's the effect on public and donor support? And I've seen, especially in some of our, what I'll call the I-90 corridor locations, the tremendous emotional reaction that people have to the sale of art, even if the organization makes a very good case for it. So the example for this is the Seward House Museum in Auburn, New York, which sold off a Thomas Cole painting. It's in the process of selling off a Thomas Cole painting. And they've done a good job of explaining why it was necessary. We were participants in the court proceeding, but this is a message that you have to make sure you're right and comfortable with your decision, and also that you've involved people in making the decision. And don't just do it in the middle of the night. Next slide, please.
Jim.
Yeah.
Actually, after this, I'll give you some questions. Yep.
Did you want to keep going?
Yeah, let me share some questions right now.
Okay.
So another possible, as an alternative to drawing from the endowment, what are your thoughts about accepting EIDL monies in order to provide a backstop for future problems? Will funders look favorably upon an organization that is more secure going forward, or will the presence of debt be viewed negatively? Assume the monies are set aside in a separate account set up for emergencies requiring board approval for use.
Tell me what EIDL is.
I don't know. We'll find out. Let me see if someone who asked the question is responding. Otherwise, we'll go on to the next question, which is, what is the AG's reaction regarding the AAMD's position change on authorizing deaccessions for 2 years for any reason?
I didn't know it was that broad, to be honest. I think it's important in New York to understand that you're still governed by the Board of Regents rules, which prohibit deaccessioning except to make additional acquisitions for your collection. And I'm not sure that's currently their regulation. I'm not sure how it's going to play out. For non-museum entities, the concern you always have is in the nonprofit world is that it's used to support the continuing paying the salaries to the senior officers of the organization. After that, it becomes clear that cuts are going to have to be made. So deaccessioning should not be the first step or the second step or the third step. It should be part of an overall economic plan of the organization. And you should make sure you've thought through what the implications are for your audience and for your community.
Got it. I did hear, we do know right now that EIDL is the SBA loan from the CARES Act.
Okay.
So
remember, so there's a difference. I talked about borrowing from the endowment, and that means that you're actually taking money, you're selling off assets that are in the endowment. Taking money from EIDL, I think, is part of a prudent strategy, especially since we don't know right now whether you'll have to pay back at all, right?
Right, exactly.
So prudence is an important part of this picture of the NIPMFA, the Prudent Management Institutional Funds and the use of your assets. And what we look for is that there's been thought, that it's documented in the board minutes, and there have been discussions about why this makes sense and how it's better than the alternatives.
Great. And then I do have another question about, interesting, will surplus be viewed negatively by a funder? It's really a fundraising question, but by a funder after this economic downturn, we are all in this year with lost revenue. Will surplus be viewed negatively? I would say no, but
no,
I would.
God bless you if you have a surplus, and I think it's, the question is, are you continuing your mission and continuing your cultural activity?
Yeah. Okay. Great. Let's keep going.
Okay. Next slide, please. Good. So preserving, protecting, adapting, responding, and again, I've heard a number of people talk in the last few months. We're not going to go back to normal. There's going to be a new normal, and so part of what the responsibility of the board and the officers is not just preserving, but adapting and responding. And that includes a risk assessment of, what are the major threats, what are the weaknesses of the organization, how are we going to address them? This risk assessment should be part of a board's activity on an annual basis anyway. But especially now, you have to think about what the risks are and what are you prepared for. Potential harms to classes of beneficiaries. So if you cut out your education function, what does that do? So it's not just about no margin, no mission, that you're thinking about your mission as an organization and how cuts or changes are going to affect it. And the best model I've seen for this is the Wheelock College teach-out model. Wheelock College their board realized that they could not survive as a liberal arts college in the Boston area over the longer term. They had money, they had an endowment, but the trend lines just told them that they were not going to survive. They decided to merge with Boston University. Very careful, thorough plan for that. And what they focused on was what happens to the students we were responsible for who signed up with us 4 years ago or 3 years ago. What's going to happen to them? Do they have access to other programs? And I cite the Wheelock College model, the teach out, meaning I signed up 3 years ago. I'm supposed to get a degree from this school and such. Are my credits transferable? Can I get my scholarship? Can I get tuition at the same rate? And Wheelock actually transferred most of its funds to Boston University with the commitment by BU to do these things and to make sure they had metrics to make sure they were happening. And that contrasts with Mount Ida College, which announced in April was closing in May in Massachusetts, and very poor planning in my view, and exactly the wrong way to go. And they kept hoping that they were going to survive and didn't plan for what in time to make those arrangements, and just sold their campus to the University of Massachusetts. So thinking about the harms to class of beneficiaries and preserving and protecting, it's not just about do we open, do we close? It's also thinking about affiliations, right? Is there somebody else we can work with to do the things that we want to do? Joint ventures, can we do things together? Transfers of assets, as they did in Wheelock. Dissolution, which is basically the end of organizations. Okay.
Jim,
and then,
sorry, I just have to, because a lot of our community is now weighing in and just reminding us that the EIDL does have to be paid back. It's a different loan program than PPP, which are potentially forgivable. So thank you guys for writing in.
No, I appreciate that because my expertise is not there. Merger is also a possibility, and as we cite the successful merger of Pregones and the Puerto Rican Traveling Theater, and then reaching out to your funding sources and telling them what you're planning to do, why you're planning to do it, and how it works. Next slide, please. Insurance. This could be a PowerPoint presentation in itself. The key is thinking about your directors and officers and whether they have both indemnification and insurance coverage for errors and omissions. And do not let that go during a period of financial crisis. If you're asking a lot from these people, you need to protect them. General liability and property casualty. Again, this could be a whole PowerPoint. Next slide, please.
I think it was interesting for me to learn that this is actually not required legally, which when I've been the head of organizations, I always thought was the case. So good to examine that, but also yeah.
A good board member should never sign up to be a board member of an organization that does not provide insurance. Director's
insurance. Okay, there you go. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, the next issue is thinking if you have over $750,000 in income in New York, you have to have an audit. And one of the issues in current time is what's called the going concern qualification to opinions. The thing for board members to think about and for the officers is, what are management's plans to mitigate the effect of the conditions, that is COVID, and the auditors assess the likelihood that plans can be effectively implemented. So if you're on the board, you want to find out, did the auditor raise this issue, and what was the response of management? And then management letters also, if you need to know if they were considered. Next slide, please.
I do want to ask so quickly, because material weaknesses have always been a red flag.
Right.
But during these times, are they going to be received differently?
Here's my concern. I think the auditors are going to be much more careful on these two issues. Moody's is downgrading a lot of institutions, so the auditors are concerned about the lawsuits that they're going to face, and also their professional responsibility. There's a lot greater risks today than there were 5 years ago for these institutions. So they at least have to ask the questions, and their work papers are going to reflect what the answers are.
Okay. And also just to note that the audit threshold is $750,000, but it's going to move to $1 million next year, right?
Correct.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. Okay. So what are responsibilities of officers and directors in hard times? We ask you to look to your charter and to your IRS 990, which describes your mission. And you can see the mission of the College of New Rochelle, which was original commitment to women, and then people did not have access to higher education before this. And as I said earlier, I think they did a very good job of thinking through that responsibility and mission, moving their assets to Mercy College to support the students who they had been previously teaching. And those are hard decisions because there is no more College of New Rochelle, but they did the right thing. Next slide, please. And I wanted to give you a couple of other examples of organizations where you look to their charter to see what they're doing. Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora Arts, particularly significant issue as we can see around the world in the last few weeks. How do you use your visual performing arts for encouraging dialogue on these issues? Their mission has become even more significant today, and they talk about arts and advocacy. So again, if I was on the board and as the CEO, I'd be looking to those documents to say, what do we keep? Where do we move to? How do we make it work? Next slide. Garth Fagan Dance. Again, one of the things that I'm looking at Garth Fagan Dance and other organizations, especially in the dance space, it's not just performances, although they perform nationally. It's also teaching and student institute and virtual public classes, moving, all part of their overall mission, but moving toward responding to the needs that exist in the current climate. Next slide, please. And this is one of my favorites. The carousel site of the Niagara Frontier. It's an old carousel museum in North Tonawanda, which is where I used to live when I was very young. And it's a primarily volunteer organization. They do get grants, I believe, from NYSCA, among others. And in this case, the entire building and facility itself is a National Historic Site and a community resource for family recreation and learning. So, if we think about space, sometimes is critical to the mission and some are not. In this case, the space is critical to the mission and to their programming. And I do like their slogan, once around is never enough. Next slide, please. I wanted to end with Charities Bureau. You will, a number of organizations register with us. Museums that don't do fundraising do not register with us. But it's important, I think, in looking at grants access, both for foundations and for government agencies, to make sure you're registered and that your registration is timely, because we get requests all the time from agencies saying, please tell us that these people are current, this organization is current in its filings. And you can look it up on our website to see if you are. If you get a letter from us saying your filing is incomplete, please address those things, because we get these panic calls about 2 days before a funding grant deadline occurs saying, please, can't you tell the state agency or the city agency that we're compliant, and we'll get that stuff to you after. And my assistant, Eileen, says, we're the Attorney General's office. We can't tell them things that are not true. But that's so important to do that. You want questions about fundraising or transactions or complaints about charities, each of these is an attended email account, and you'll get a response quickly. We have attorneys of the day for every issue. We get about 60 calls a day or emails now about a variety of issues, and we try to be responsive in a relatively short period of time. Next slide, please. Did you want, Mara, did you?
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions, but do you want to just go over these and then we can take those? Yep.
So this is these are other things that are available. We have guidance on coronavirus resources, which Karen wrote, and useful for seeing what else is out there, and series of guidance documents about the topics I covered, which you can read at your leisure.
I just wanted to jump in for one second. When you were talking about audits, I was technologically challenged and couldn't unmute myself. But it's important to note that audits are required in New York, of organizations required to register with the Attorney General because they're soliciting contributions in New York. So it does not apply to all organizations, but we think for many organizations, it's prudent to have an audit. And for many organizations, they have to do an audit anyway because their funders require it. But the law does not cover all organizations.
Although, Karen, that includes requests for funding from government agencies, right?
Yes, it's solicitation of contributions, and contributions are defined in part as grants from government agencies.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so here's some questions from our audience. One is, our museum and others was founded before the New York State Board of Regents, I guess, were created, and is chartered by the New York State Department of State. Does that department have deaccessioning rules / guidelines, and how to easily find them?
The Department of State does not have deaccessioning guidelines. Their function is basically to be a registry of all incorporated entities in New York State, so they have not addressed this issue at all.
Okay. So where does someone go? Where does that museum go? To you?
No, if it's a museum, the Board of Regents is the primary regulator, and they have guidance which I can send to you, Mara, after this is over.
Okay, but it says that this museum was founded before the Board of Regents existed. Is that possible?
They are still over. Yes, it is. There are a number of museums which were founded by a special act of the legislature in the 19th century.
Okay.
My understanding is that they're certainly still governed by the not-for-profit corporation law and the state corporation law, because they were grandfathered into that process. And so I do not believe that they have the ability to not follow the region's direction.
Okay, got it. So this might be off topic, but I think it's still relevant to you. It says, the Charities Bureau, it says, how serious are such nonprofit organization infractions as not being compliant with the New York State Nonprofit Compliance Act, or not following the organization's own bylaws, say for 5 years or more, and applying for and receiving grant funding from the state, county, and other sources during the same period of NCA non-compliance by law ignoring? Would the Charities Bureau investigate nonprofits charged with such complaints? And if so, what kind of penalties could board members face if they were found to be complicit in such infractions?
Sounds like there's something going on in that organization. Okay, so here's the Attorney General's job is twofold. One is to be an advocate for the nonprofit sector, because it needs an advocate, and we've been that since 1604 in various guises. And the second is to be a regulator. And the purpose of regulation is not to do gotcha. The purpose of regulation is to say, we have a cookbook for how these things are supposed to work. We want to work with you and make sure that you understand it, that people in the organization are educated about it, and that there is compliance for significant purposes. So Karen manages our complaint docket, which is about 600 complaints a year. And our preference is to reach out to people and say, here's first, to protect whistleblowers who come in with serious infractions so that we're not giving up their name or their identity. But the second part is that if we identify a weakness, we want it to be fixed. And we do that through our evaluation of the filings that come in, and they get letters saying, you didn't give us this, you didn't give us this. We always prefer to talk to the organization and say, these are the issues that we've identified, tell us how you're going to address them. So Karen ran a project some years ago, like 2 or 3 years ago, on loans to officers. In New York, you're forbidden to loan money to officers as a charity. You just can't do it. So we did a data analysis of IRS 990s, and we found over 150 organizations that loan money to officers.
Wow.
We didn't then send out Karen with a hatchet. What we did was to send letters to them saying, we've identified this on your 990. The statute says this, directors have specific responsibility. Please tell us the amount of the loan, what the interest rate was, who approved it, and what you're going to do going forward. And that, to me, is really the way a good regulator ought to operate. Now, obviously, there are going to be organizations that the conduct is so egregious that we have to do investigation. But that's a relatively small number, and we try to do what I'll call responsive regulation first.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. So do the same rules apply? Another question: do the same rules apply to a board-designated reserve fund or operating surplus that isn't invested and isn't an endowment per se?
Okay, so a board-operated reserve fund, which is not an endowment, it's just board-designated, is not subject to the Prudent Management Institutional Funds Act that we talked about. That is the 7% presumed imprudence rule. It is subject to the rules on institutional funds, which said you still have to invest it thoughtfully, you still have to manage it, and you have to act as a prudent person in making decisions about it.
Got it. Okay, thank you. So here's a topical one, very topical. Is there specificity on 501c3's limitation on engaging in political activity? There are growing public statements taking sides, especially around police issues. What are the parameters? What is advocacy versus political activity?
Okay, so Karen has drafted guidance that is in the process of being reviewed internally, and I expect we'll have that in July. There is no prohibition on nonprofit organizations expressing their opinions about matters of public interest. There is no prohibition. There's a limited prohibition. There's a limitation on how much money you can spend on actual lobbying, which is shown on your IRS 990. The one thing that you cannot do is advocate for the election or unelection of a specific political candidate. It's expressing your opinion about matters of current interest to me is not just, it's not just permitted. Part of what we expect from the arts and we expect from nonprofits is to be the conscience of the society and to say this is wrong and this is why, which is different than saying, elect Tish James or Andrew Cuomo or vote against them. And that's what the statute prohibits.
Got it. Okay. So there's another question about endowments. This is actually a fundraising question. So I'm actually going to, someone asked about how board members increase fundraising efforts right now. I would please steer you to our first webinar about fundraising. So that's online. And also there's a number of questions about grants that I think NYSCA's made that couldn't be completed in spring 2020. I will just say we are extending, we're providing extensions and modifications. Please reach your program officer if you have that specific matter, if you're dealing with that matter. Okay, here's another one about endowments. Can you release a donation that was made specifically for the endowment?
You cannot, if the donation is for the endowment, you cannot release it by yourself. You have to either go back to the donor if the donor is still alive, or you have to come to us if it's less than $100,000 and more than 20 years old, or you have to go to the court. And again, we'll work with you on that and talk about what's required, because only a court can make the decision about releasing a restriction. That's a restriction that's contained in the gift instrument. And that's you have to show impracticability or impossibility. And we'll work with you to tell you what the standards are and how to get there.
Great, thank you. Also, can you comment on the difference between an audit and a review?
I don't want to be a smart aleck here, but the review is basically the accountant taking what you give them and feeding it back to you. It's a very, very limited analysis of the accuracy and reliability and actual reliability of the financial statement. An audit represents an actual opinion by the auditor that the financial statements of the organization reflect in all material respects the financial situation of the organization in accordance with audit standards. Much, much higher standard. And in an audit, what you don't see in an audit are the extensive work papers that accountants do to support each part of that audit to make sure it's consistent. And we have had the opportunity to look at the work papers of auditors, which most clients don't get to see. And good accountants do a very, very thorough job. And everything you tell an auditor in that audit gets written down on the work papers. So so it's a much more rigorous process.
Great. One last question here that we can take. Well, I think we're just at time. So what are possible legal actions that could be taken if museum doors remain closed for a number of years with a collection, storage, and no public access?
Okay, so one of the obligations of the Attorney General or statutory roles is to bring actions, first to work with the organization to say, where are you, what's happening, why does this make sense? To conduct an inquiry to say, how did the board make this decision? What assets does the organization have? How are they used? And what are your plans for reopening? And what alternatives do you consider? And we have the right to go to court and ask the court to determine that the directors aren't doing their job, the officers aren't doing their job, they should be removed, or there should be action taken to reverse the decisions they made or replace the directors. And we've done this. I think the most common one we've had is our parades, which are a whole different world.
Is it what the
parades, so there are parades where the directors weren't doing what they're supposed to do, so we had to go to court. We had to ask for an order removing the directors, appointing new directors, and moving forward from there. We don't like to do that. One of the basic ideas is that there's self-government in nonprofits, but there are circumstances under which that's appropriate. And I think, if you have multiple year closures of an entity, before we go to court, we're going to ask some very difficult questions about why does this make sense? What alternatives do you consider? Let's look at your minutes. Are your directors engaged? Are you still paying your executive director and other people when nothing has happened? So I would be very concerned about that, would want to know about it.
Great. Sounds like one of the key takeaways for me from this session is to document, 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 right? As you go, as you're moving through this time, especially, make sure it really would have been really valuable to have documented up to this time what the situation has been at your institution.
But can I document is the kind of advice lawyers give after the fact sometimes.
Okay.
We are very much focused on the process,
Okay.
which is talk, 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 discuss, think, analyze, and then the documents reflect that you did that.
Document those, yes. Okay,
Right.
Great. Thank you. So we are at time, and we do have some more questions, but we're going to make sure to share those with Jim and Karen, and they're going to be able to get back to you with responses. It's been a great conversation, very rich, very complex. These are very complex times indeed. I want to thank you guys for joining us today. And there's questions about, yes, we're going to be posting this on our webinar, on our website. If it's not today, it'll go up tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. And we'll be sending you details about our next NYSCA Presents website shortly. I want to take this moment to shout out to our superb staff who've been working nonstop together apart. Our team is here for you. We know that the arts and culture sector contributes $120 billion to the state's economy. And as such, we are going to be vital in our state's recovery. And our community is, above all, inventive, resilient, and creative. Throughout history, the arts have and will continue to play a crucial role in the health of our state. We are honored to stand together with you on this journey. Thank you guys for joining us today.